Yo, Prison Trump here to teach you the finer points of drafting a Druid. Druid is one of those classes which is rock solid. You usually are able to just get some quality cards, which the Druid class has plenty of. Druids tend to be pretty slow going and control the pace of the game, and just go for the late game, where their late game is generally bigger and badder than the opponent's. They have some of the best cards in the epic slots with the ancients, so consider yourself blessed if you get those, but even if you don't, you should do fine with the arsenal of common and rare good cards that the Druid has in their class. This used to be my best win percentage class, the Druid. Just a very sturdy class. Alright, yo, we've just begun, and already we got a tough choice, but I will explain the cards from left to right. So we got Arcane Golem. Like I said at the beginning, Druids tend to be a controlling deck, and you can't force a rush deck from the beginning. If you choose Arcane Golem, you are a big dummy. The choice is between Emperor Cobra and Wild Pyromancer. The Emperor Cobra is typically a strong choice, as it just axes whichever thing it bites. I like that. The Wild Pyromancer, though, is a good 2-mana 3/2 with upside, and the Druid tends to have some good spells. I thought long and hard about this choice, and my conclusion was that it's close enough that it's kind of up to preference. The Pyro is better if I get more spells, and this is the first pick. The Cobra is just generally good. I'll pick the Pyro, after much deliberation. In this pack, we got the Reckless Rocketeer, and if you were to pick that card, then you have about as many brains as the goblin driving that contraption. That card is an overpriced piece of removal, and again, we're not rushing fast enough to make use of that damage. Power of the Wild, that is an excellent card, very flexible, able to be a 2-mana 3/2, which is good by itself, but one of the things about 2-mana minions, which are just 3/2s, are that in the late game they're poor. Now as a Druid, you're going to be able to use that Power of the Wild in the late game to good effect sometimes to give a massive buff out. So that is why Power of the Wild is such a strong card and one of the better common cards in the Druid arsenal. Darkscale Healer is a fine card, slightly better in Druid because you tend to have higher health minions to actually make a use of the battle cry, but the Power of the Wild is far too good to pass up. Here we got the Bloodsail Raider, a basic 2/3 for 2. That's not a terrible card, but we certainly won't pick it when we have many better cards in the pick. We got the Wrath, which is a good basic removal card, 2 mana, deal 3 damage, and also has the flexibility of in the late game, like Power of the Wild. When that just don't cut it, you can always cycle and draw a card. Spectral Knight is aight. A little bit worse than people think it is, but it's still aight. In this case, we choose the Wrath. It is worth mentioning that is going to mean the first 3 picks are all on 2 cards, so the remaining picks we're going to lean on higher cards. I actually paused for a moment to think about, wait, first 3 picks, all 2 drops, should I pick the Spectral Knight? Under the basis that I will get 2s later on, and I've decided on no, because the Spectral Knight isn't that good to take. I think there will be opportunities to choose a better card than a 2-drop at a later juncture. Another tough choice here. They can just wave the pint-sized summoner off. Her 2-mana 2/2-ness just doesn't cut it here. We got some big boys. We got the Keeper of the Grove, which is an extremely efficient 4-drop, able to 2 for 1 very often. You play it on turn 4, you cap their 3/2, and it still keeps fighting. And then we got the Azure Drake, which is essentially one of the best neutral cards out there. This one is a very tough choice. One of the reasons why Azure Drake is even better in Druid is because of the spell damage. You get the spell damage with the swipe, or you get it with the Wrath I already have. You get some pretty good value out of it. The Keeper of the Grove is good by itself always, so is the Azure Drake. I think this one is quite a close toss-up. Hey, we finally get to make some easy decisions here. We've got the big losers in this pack. One of the worst cards in Nax Rammus, the 3-mana Stoneskin Gargoyle, which is a 1/4. Oh, but I'm a druid. I can get Mark of the Wild and Mark of Nature and put it on the Stoneskin Gargoyle, you might say. Well, you are a dummy, and that does not justify picking a bad card to make a bad combo. Gnomish Inventor, now that's some value. You draw a card, you 2 for 1 your opponent as you kill off an opponent's card. That's good stuff. Silverback Patriarch, if you pick this card, then you clearly don't understand that taunts are no good if their stats are bad, and you might not have any hope left in you. Learn faster, play better, pick good cards. Here we've got Thrallmar Farseer, a weak 3-mana 2/3, you play it, they can send their 2-mana 3/2 into it. Even worse, they have a 3-mana 3/3, it kills the Farseer. The Wind Fury cards tend to be weak because their stats are weak. We got a Voodoo Doctor here, a 1 health minion. Try to avoid those because Arena is full of classes which can deal 1 damage and pick these off. Not to mention it's just too weak stats to justify use of a card. Sen'jin Shield Master, now that's a card. We got the tough 5 health body. Nice to see the Ventrico Mercenary here, one of my favorite big cards. This is one of the cards which is the biggest and comes out the earliest. The drawback looks severe, and it is. But oftentimes when you play it, the opponent will have almost no choice but to kill it as soon as possible, otherwise they will be taking massive damage. Cobalt Geomancer is a card that is perhaps slightly better in Druid, but certainly does not justify the pick here. It's overall weak card, and I don't have the swipes yet to possibly combo with the Geomancer. That is where it is at its strongest. Mark of the Wild is an acceptable card, but just doesn't hold compared to the Ventrico Mercenary. We have a tough choice here again. We got the Leper Gnome, which is not the tough choice. So far these picks have been aimed towards what the Druid usually does. Control the board, outvalue the opponent. The Leper Gnome does not play into that. It's usually you throw a card down, they hero ability it, you've lost a card, they've taken some damage, you've gained some tempo, but not what we're going for here. So the pick is between Oasis Snapjaw, which is a 4-mana 2/7, which is not bad, those stats. Sometimes it gets completely blown out of the water by Stampeding Kodo. And then you've got the 5-mana Spiteful Smith. You look at the text and it's like, oh, Druids don't have weapons. Why would I ever pick that card? But you look at the stats. If you just imagine it as a 5-mana 4/6, then that's the way to really consider what a Smith is. Looking at the mana curve, we've got 2 4s and 2 5s so far. So I think either of these picks is fine, and they're relatively close in power. I will pick the Smith here. I think it is slightly more powerful than the Snapjaw, and I like not randomly losing games to Kodo sometimes. Not to say that I won't pick the Snapjaw over weaker cards, but Spiteful Smith is alright. Nice, now this is what I'm talking about. We got one of the best early game cards in the game for these board control decks, Zombie Chow. Zombie Chow is a mighty 1 mana for 5 stats. And in a Druid deck, in any board control deck, this Death Rattle restore 5 health to the enemy hero tends to not matter much, since it's usually a fight for board control, and once you have the board control, you kill your opponent at your leisure. That's compared to Raging Worgen, which is a distinctly average card. No real way to activate it here other than the Pyromancer, though the fact that I have a Pyromancer makes the Raging Worgen slightly better, but not nearly as good as the Zombie Chow. And the Mark of Nature, which is a fairly weak buff. Yes, it's like a 3 mana 4/0 charge, or a 3 mana 0/4 charge, because you can instantly use it on the card that you've buffed. But you can pay 1 mana for a Shield Master, which is a 0/4, and you can pay, well, there are no minions in the game which are 4/0, but the Mark of Nature, when you think of it this way, is not that strong. We're making some tough picks here. All 3 of these cards are top tier cards. We got the Argent Commander, which is the Get Things Done card. You use it and you're almost guaranteed to get a 2-for-1. You got the Sludge Belcher, which is an excellent defensive card. Taz Dingo +1 gets a 1/2 out. Tends to be better than Taz Dingo. And then you got a Starfall. The flexibility to either just nuke a guy or to do 2 damage to all is pretty useful. Of course, you would be happy with any of these cards, and if I had the option, I would pick all 3 of these cards. I will say that the Sludge Belcher tends to be a little bit weaker in this deck because I already have 3 5-drops, and Sludge Belcher is not quite as good in Arena as it is in Constructed, in my opinion, because it's typically a big fight for board control, and once the opponent has board control, the Sludge Belcher does little to take back the board control. It simply delays, but often in Arena, you don't have a good reason to delay things. So it's between Argent Commander and Starfall. Starfall has a bit more synergy in this deck due to having the Wild Pyromancer and the Azure Drake, and the effect is nice, so I will pick it here. Whoa, legendary. We've got Myexna, not nearly as bad in Arena as it is in Constructed, since Arena is all about creature minion combat, and Myexna kills any minion that it fights. Arena is slow enough that Myexna can be used effectively. But far better than it is the card right next to it, the Karen Bloodhoof, which is one of the best cards in Arena, nearly always outvalues your opponent, sometimes gets 3-for-1s, 4-for-1s, intense value. Millhouse Mana Storm is far too risky in Arena, where you often will have a wide variety of spells you wouldn't normally see in Constructed. In fact, it's also too dangerous in Constructed. This pack features the Shattered Sun Cleric, which is a very strong 3 mana, 3/2 with a buff. It is weaker when you don't have enough early game, but since we're at 1/3 of the way through the arena and we already have 4 early game cards, that looks like it'll have a target already, so it's quite strong in this deck. Raid Leader, this guy couldn't even lead a raid to success in fighting Onyxia. You look at the stats are quite poor. You play it when you're ahead and you're even further ahead. You play it when you're behind and it's useless. Raid Leader is a very bad card. And then you've got Claw, which is a reasonable removal card, and would sometimes be picked over Shattered Sun Cleric if you did not have enough early game. But I have enough to take advantage of this buff. This buffing Zombie Chow in particular would be very nice. Here we got Leper Gnome, which is icky and doesn't do enough in the deck, Mad Bomber, a solid 2 mana 3/2. The battle cry will usually be in our favor because as a control deck, oftentimes you're just trying to stop the aggressive decks. You play this guy, sometimes you randomly snipe off an infiltrator, or if you're lucky enough, an opposing 2 mana 3/2. And it has the utility in the late game of sometimes helping you kill a 3/2 alongside with your hero ability, or just combat math in general. Lord of the Arena, 5 health, 6 mana, not enough. This is one of these picks where you cannot just use a arena draft value calculator to tell you which one of these cards is better. You gotta look at the big picture. And in this deck, we've got 5 cards already that are 5 and more. So we've got our late game covered for the halfway point so far. In fact, we've got an above average amount of it. What we lack is cards in the mid game area. So Shattered Sun Cleric is going to be a very good choice here. In addition, because we do have the amount of cards to buff stuff with it. The Venture Co-Mercenary could have been the option instead if we didn't already have that much late game. Dread Corsair is a big loser, and if you take this, then I am revoking your pirate license. This pack is not very exciting. Some may look at the Cobalt Geomancer and note its synergy with Starfall, but that is a 7 mana combo and is not worth aiming towards. As far as early game goes, we have enough, and the Geomancer should be considered early game, because you will oftentimes play that as a 2 mana 2/2. Soul of the Forest tends to be a card which typically is not able to be used to good enough effectiveness. In order for this card to be valuable, you need to use it when you have 3 minions on the board, because then it's 4 mana 6/6 of stuff, and it's very slow and delayed, and that just is a situation that doesn't come up enough when you're not already far ahead for it to generally be justified as a pick. So the pick is going to be the weak Silvermoon Guardian, but it is a mid-game card and it's fun. This pack features a Defender of Argus. Defender of Argus is good if you have enough early game to support it. I have been saying we've got enough early game for quite some time now, and we did pick up a Mad Bomber in between that. We've got 5 going into the halfway point, and I feel fairly secure that Defender of Argus will get more value than usual in this arena. Emperor Cobra is also a strong pick. But the Defender of Argus just tends to be better. Master Swordsmith is very weak. Looking at the stats, it's very poor to play individually, and that itself is enough to not make it useful in Arena, where individual power level of cards is so important. Alright, in this pack we got 2 of the best 4-drops for the common slot. We just ignore that the innervate is even here. Yes, you can get some really good starts with the innervate, and innervate, of course, everyone runs 2 of in constructed, but in Arena, you tend to run out of cards as the games get dragged out into the late game, and you don't have those Ancient of Lores to refill your hand. So innervate actually turns out to be a bad card. The choice between the Yeti and the Dark Iron Dwarf is very challenging. The Yeti is better when you don't have that much early game, because it's just solid, it's secure, you play it. It's the standard, almost always pick the card. But the card to consider over it would be the Dark Iron Dwarf, which is stronger if you have a board presence already, and then you can buff a card. You end up getting more stats than the Chillwind Yeti, because you have a 6/4 instead of a 4/5. And better than that, the 6/4 has partial charge, because you're giving it to a minion, which is presumably about to trade with another one. This Dark Iron Dwarf And looking at the deck, it's somewhat resemblance of Zoo, because there's 2 Shattered Sun Clerics and a Defender of Argus already. So there's a lot of focus on getting cards out there and then buffing them and then sending them in. To pick the Dark Iron Dwarf would be kind of going all in on this play early game cards and then buff them and make favorable trades type plan. And I think you might as well carry an idea to its end. So in this one, I will pick the Dark Iron Dwarf over the Chillwind Yeti, and it's close. Here we've got some rather unexciting cards. Ironfur Grizzly, an unexciting 3 mana 3/3. Direwolf Alpha. It is better in decks where you have an early game presence, and again, it seems like everything is pushing us towards having an early game presence and then buffing the cards as we make this Druid Zoo deck. So I will be choosing the Direwolf Alpha. The Ironbeak Owl is sometimes useful utility, especially if Naxxramas has Death Rattle cards, but I still tend to devalue the card quite a bit just because of the weak stats. Here we have Innervate against 2 rather weak cards, which may lead me to pick the Innervate. Bluegill Warrior is a sufficient card sometimes. In this deck, there's enough early game to not need to pick a mediocre 2/1 charge. Silvermoon Guardian is a mediocre mid-game card. I've already got enough 4s, so here I will take the Innervate just to speed out something. I'm going to say this here, Force of Nature is not as good as it looks. It is basically 6 mana, deal 6 damage quite flexibly. But it is still better, I would say, than the Faceless Manipulator here, even though the Faceless Manipulator can manipulate Cairn Bloodhoof, which is really nice. That is about the only target right now. South Sea Captain is a 3 mana 3/3, which is not better than the Force of Nature. I will take the spell here. It's nice to have late game flexible removal. I am very happy to see the Harvest Golem here. With so many cards which buff cards, having minions which stick around will do great stuff for this deck. And this deck has a low amount of 3-drops, so the Harvest Golem is just about one of the best cards that could be opened. Stranglethorn Tiger is also strong, but not as strong given the necessity for a 3-drop. And Loot Hoarder is also a nice filler card, but the Harvest Golem just has its beat on stats and being able to stick around and just being a quality card overall. Easy pick here, the Novice Engineer is one of those filler cards you pick up if your other cards suck. In this case, the Power of the Wild is a very strong card. I do like having a few more 2-drops, especially those that are flexible and can be used for the mass buff instead in the late game. Frostwolf Grunt is... no. 2 mana 2/2. No. Some good cards here again, like the... oh, not the Magma Rager, just kidding. That card sucks. You throw it on the ground, and then the opponent uses their hero ability to kill it with less mana than you spend playing it. So what we have here is a Starfire, which is good for the late game. With already 2 cards on 6, the Starfire is perhaps not necessary, and having another Harvest Golem to secure this early mid-game is really good given how many cards there are to buff it here. Sometimes you would pick the Starfire over the Harvest Golem, but in this case, everything that this deck is built towards relies on buffing cards already out on the table. And for that, you want the Harvest Golem, and you want a good smooth curve in the early game. Now here we got a 2-mana 1/4 chump. That doesn't match up to the quality of 2-mana cards we've been getting so far. There's a 2-mana 2/3. Again, that doesn't match up to the quality of the cards we've got so far. Though I will say that the River Crocolisk is a bit better in this deck due to all of the buffing, especially the 2 Shadowed Sun Clerics. You play the River Crocolisk, you play the Shadowed Sun Cleric, you buff it, you kill the opponent's 3/2. You still have a 3/1. It's nice. But it is also good to pick up a Starfire, given that I think the early game is covered with a Zombie Chow, 2 Power of the Wild, Wrath, Direwolf Alpha, Mad Bomber, Pyromancer, and Innervate is also an early game card which moves a 4 down into a 2. That's good, so I can pick up the late game, a nice flexible burst of damage on something which draws a card. So far this deck is shaping up very nicely. Acolyte of Pain is a card I don't give much love to. In this deck, there are a few buff cards which might buff it out of 3 health range, which a lot of 3/2s kill. So it may serve a bit more value than usual. Also, cards with Naxxramas tend to be a little bit weaker. You see some 1-attack minions, and you see some 2-attack minions. Acolyte of Pain is slightly better, and I do pick it over the bad Voodoo Doctor and the weak Geomancer here. In this pack, we have Dancing Swords, which is a card more oriented towards the tempo decks. This deck is looking like it could be a tempo deck since the curve is skewed towards the lower side and you buff cards. And Dancing Swords is something that you can play early, it's strong, and then you buff it since it'll stay alive. But still, I think that we don't need to put that much into the tempo game, as we do also have a late game. This deck is just an all-around good deck so far, and there's no need to put in this card with a severe drawback in it. The way I value draw a card is generally 1.5 mana. So if your opponent draws a card, then this is like Dancing Swords is 4.5 mana for a 4/4, which is not very good. Corehound, 7 mana, 9/5. That's no good, although I did consider it because I am not a big fan of Mark of Nature either. But Mark of Nature is going to turn out to be the best card here. Though it's not exceptional, it is better than the alternatives. Clear pick here. You pick the Swipe. One of the reasons why Druid is good. You have a very common spell which has the potential to 2-for-1 or 3-for-1 your opponent, and even just playing it on one minion tends to trade about evenly. Mark of the Wild, no good. Ironforge Rifleman, that gun is more like a bee sting, doesn't do enough. Here we've got yet another Intrepid Gnomish Inventor. These cards which draw cards and still have a strong body attached to them, or a reasonable body, are very good in Arena, and will be the pick here. Razorfen Hunter, we've got enough 3-drops. And Innervate, again, I've said it, there's not that much worth innervating out. You might run out of cards. Happy to pick a card which refuels after what looks to be an early game which is going to put a lot of pressure, put the screws to the opponent. Here we've got a bad scientist, as we have no secrets. It's even worse than the Frostwolf Grunt, which is also bad, so Razorfen Hunter is the pick. And finally, South Sea Captain, 3 mana, 3/3, not very exciting. Sea Giant, very exciting, best giant out there. This deck does need something big near the end. The big cards so far are just Ventrico Mercenary and Cairn Bloodhoof. So this Sea Giant is a huge blessing. The Blood Knight is a good card as well, but the Sea Giant is exactly what this deck ordered. So we are a little sad not to have picked up the better epics than Force of Nature. We're looking at Ancient of Lore and Ancient of War, and we're a little sad not to have picked up the other good Druid cards of Druid of the Claw and Ironbark Protector. But the Ironbark Protector problem is solved because there's enough late game here with the Sea Giant, the Cairn, the Starfire, and the Ventrico Mercenary. And even more than that, this deck has that early game board control starting on turn 2 and sometimes turn 1 with Zombie Chow and Innervate, and then has a whole suite of cards to buff things and then just keep the board control. And if the board control is lost, there are some catch-up mechanisms in here involving the Wild Pyromancer or Swipe or Starfall. So this deck is very well rounded, has one of the best curves that I've seen. The early game is very well balanced with Chow, 2 power, Wrath, Bomber, Pyro, and then the Innervate can sometimes pull something out early as well. It's actually not as much early game as I thought I had. I was about to say the Power of the Wilds can also flexibly be used in the late game, and that'll happen sometimes as well, but perhaps more often they will be used as 2 mana 3/2s, which is perfectly fine and good. Very strong 3-drops, especially if I manage to get a 1 and or a 2 drop off. Very strong 4-drops, and a very strong 5-drop pull and 6/10. This deck's got a bit of everything on all directions. So play your cards on curve, win game, that's the plan. Have the cards stay on the board, buff them. A fairly straightforward board control deck, but the cards are stacked in our favor this time, so let's give it a whirl. This deck's got pretty good stuff in it, and I'm going to predict it goes 12 wins.